Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is going to be the fourth installment on my Beatles US Capitol album deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about the double album called The Beatles Story. Now this really is essentially a documentary on the Beatles' rise to fame. It is a double album. It's a bit sprawling, but there's no denying this is a cash grab on the part of Capitol Records. They had needed a follow-up to something new. The Beatles were still in the process of recording the Beatles for Sale album. And so Capitol's original idea was that they wanted to issue a live album. So they had planned on a release of the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl from their summer Hollywood Bowl concert. And George Martin and the Beatles quickly put the kibosh on that. They said, no, these recordings are inferior. They didn't want a live album out when they were still trying to push their studio work, and they felt that a live album was essentially an inferior album of music when people could just as easily buy the original recordings. Live albums didn't have, at least in rock and roll, they didn't quite yet have the value that a studio album did. And so Capitol, after the Hollywood Bowl album got rejected, and of course in the 1970s, those recordings were resurrected along with their 1965 Hollywood Bowl concert into the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl single live album. They took basically the best recordings from both those concerts and packaged them as one album. So they eventually did get released, but just not when Capitol had originally envisioned. So left without an album, they hit upon the idea of let's put out a documentary album. And why they didn't issue this as a single album, I have no idea. But this album was priced at double what the single albums were. Back in 1964, a mono album was roughly $4 and the stereo copy was $5 or $6. This double album was $7.99 for the mono and $8.99, almost $9 for a stereo copy of this, which was a lot of money back in the day, a lot of money for what is basically just a documentary album. And so Capitol recruited two DJs from California, Roger Christian and John Babcock, to put this album together and do the narration. You've got the cover photos, which if you've seen Beatles' second album, the cover of that should look very familiar. And then on the back, in very large type, it says, "It's like spending a very special evening in the company of the Beatles themselves." Well, yes and no. If you were spending an evening in the company of the Beatles and they barely got a word in edgewise, that might be a little more accurate of a description. Yes, there is some interview material of the Beatles, but a lot of it is just one or two sentences. There's really not a lot of substance. A lot of these were taken from very quick on-the-fly interviews that were conducted as they were making their way across America. And the things that they asked about, what's your favorite color, George? Where'd you get that hairstyle, John? Just sort of the very redundant, kind of mundane questions that the Beatles tired of very quickly. So not a lot of enlightening Beatle comments that you're hearing on this album, and a lot of it is just taken up with the two DJs talking about the Beatles, trying to make sense of Beatlemania. How had the Beatles become such a fad and such a phenomenon? Talking about how they rose to fame, their beginnings at the Cavern Club in Hamburg and whatnot. Leaving out a lot of the more unsavory details of their history, obviously. So you've got a very whitewashed version of the Beatles story up to this point. And you would think, considering that the Beatles had only been a recording entity for about 2 or 3 years at this point, a double album, I could see if it was Frank Sinatra's story having a double album, but it's really padded with a lot of kind of useless trivia, stuff that most people I don't think would be very much interested in, some off-the-cuff Beatle interviews. But it's an interesting, at the same time, having said that, I do feel like it's an interesting kind of a snapshot of how the general public viewed the Beatles, what information was available at that time. And so I'm not going to say it's not worth hearing. I don't know that you're going to want to hear it over and over again, but it's still kind of an interesting kind of trip back in time, like a time capsule back to 1964, the height of Beatlemania, and kind of those innocent days of the Beatles as they were thought of back then, when they were just kind of those cute, lovable mop tops. Now, you do have some music on here, not entire songs. Usually it's the intro or transition music. Some interesting pieces of music, at least for that time. You've got a very small introduction to Twist and Shout, which opened the Hollywood Bowl album and would have been on the projected release that they had planned for the Hollywood Bowl live album. And you've got a snippet of the song Boys, which Capitol had just recently acquired the rights to from VJ Records. That's why it took, the early Beatles was released in early 1965, and it took that long because VJ owned the rights up until, I think it was October of 1964, and then those rights transferred over to EMI and Capitol Records. And so that was sort of like, oh, wow, we never heard that song before. And a month or two later, they would, because Capitol would put together the early Beatles album. But nonetheless, those are about the only, or would have been the only interesting moments. All the other music that you have here is either pulled from the music that was already available on Capitol albums, or the Holly Ridge Strings Beatles Songbook, which, of course, if you saw the Something New episode that I did, that was one of the albums that they advertised. So Capitol was kind of doing some cross-promotion by having that music as instrumental background music to the documentary that you have here. Basically, if you can get this album on the cheap, I think it's worth picking up. I wouldn't go out of my way necessarily to pick it up unless you're a diehard Beatle fan, and that's really all I would recommend it to. Either you're a hardcore Beatle fan, or you're probably not going to be too interested in it. It does have a gatefold, and these were all pictures that were taken from their trip to Washington. This is them on stage in Washington, which I believe was the first concert apart from the Ed Sullivan Show that they performed. You've got some pics from them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and then the track listing right here. I got this for Christmas. I don't know, I think I was probably like 10 or 11. And so this was like a big deal. Like, oh my God, it's 2 albums. And I was like eating everything up of the Beatles at the time. So I remember playing this and loving it. Now, no, I really don't listen to it all that much. It was available on CD for the first time with the this box set, the Beatles US albums, which I was really surprised that they released it, because I thought it was kind of one of those albums that Apple would just not see fit to release. This album, the Beatles, George Martin, Brian Epstein, their manager, had no input at all. They didn't even know this album was coming out until it was being prepped for release. Capitol, again, was just trying to churn out those Beatle records, and the market was very much saturated at this time. And I'm surprised the public didn't burn out on the Beatles by this point, because it was just in your face all the time. You had all the merchandising out there. They were coming out with albums. You had cover songs, cover albums. It was like 1964, just the world, or at least the United States in particular, went Beatle crazy. And so to me, this was kind of overkill. Am I happy we have it? Yeah, I'd rather have it than not, I suppose. And there's nothing like eye-opening or revelatory about any of the stuff on here. you do have a little bit of information about George Martin and Brian Epstein and, Capitol's self-congratulatory, well, we were partially responsible for breaking the Beatles in America, and we distributed their albums in such a way that they took off to the stratosphere as recording artists. So anyway, this is the mono copy that I have, and I don't know that there's any real differences from mono to stereo. So pick up one or the other. Don't necessarily be like me and grab both. This is the stereo copy. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this might be on the Apple label. Yeah, this is an Apple copy of it. I don't have a stereo rainbow copy of the record, but I'm always on the lookout. I always see one of these and I'm pulling it out of the jacket hoping that it is. And then this is a promotional copy. It's on the purple Capitol label, so this was issued in the late 1970s. So yeah, that's essentially the Beatles story. And shortly after this was released, the Beatles would come out with one of my favorite Capitol albums, and that's the one that I'll do my next episode on, and that is Beatles 65.